When the 2026 World Cup ends, football may lose an entire generation. Not one player, not two, an entire era. Lionel Messi, Cristiano Ronaldo, Neymar, Luka Modrić, Robert Lewandowski. For nearly 2 decades, these names have been football. And yet, most fans don't realize they're watching the ending while it's happening, because football has a strange way of making its heroes feel permanent. When you've spent your entire life watching the same players dominate the sport, it's easy to assume they'll always be there. But that's not how football works. And it's not how time works either. The 2026 World Cup will likely be the final World Cup connected to the generation that defined modern football. And what makes that significant isn't just what these players achieved, it's what they represented. To understand why, we have to go backwards, back to a completely different football world. A world before social media, before streaming, before football became a global 24-hour conversation. In 2006, a young Cristiano Ronaldo walked onto the World Cup stage in Germany. He was talented, fast, confident, but he wasn't yet Cristiano Ronaldo. Lionel Messi was there too, just 19 years old, a teenager carrying the expectations of an entire nation. Neither player knew it at the time, but they were about to begin one of the greatest rivalries in the history of sport. Over the next decade, football would become their stage. Every season felt like a competition between two impossible standards. Messi would score 50 goals. Ronaldo would score 60. Messi would win a Ballon d'Or. Ronaldo would answer with another Champions League. The numbers became absurd. Then they became normal, and that's when something strange happened. Fans stopped being impressed, not because Messi and Ronaldo got worse, but because humans adapt to greatness surprisingly quickly. What once felt impossible eventually became expected. Scoring 40 goals wasn't extraordinary anymore. It was simply what Messi and Ronaldo did. Year after year, season after season, they raised football standards so high that an entire generation grew up believing this level of dominance was normal. It wasn't. And while those two stood at the center of football's universe, other legends were quietly building their own stories. Luka Modrić wasn't supposed to dominate football. He grew up as a refugee during the Croatian War of Independence. As a child, he lived through a conflict that destroyed much of his homeland. Yet somehow, he became one of the greatest midfielders the game has ever seen. Not through power, not through speed, but through intelligence. For years, football belonged to giants. Modrić showed that vision could be just as powerful. Then there was Robert Lewandowski, one of the most consistent goal scorers in football history. A player who spent years breaking records while somehow remaining underrated. He didn't have Messi's magic or Ronaldo's celebrity, but he had something else. Relentless excellence, season after season, goal after goal, proof that greatness doesn't always arrive with headlines. Sometimes it arrives through consistency. And then there was Neymar, perhaps the most fascinating story of all, because Neymar wasn't just expected to become great, he was expected to become the greatest. When he arrived in Europe, many believed he would inherit football from Messi and Ronaldo. For a moment, it looked inevitable. The skill, the creativity, the confidence. He possessed something football rarely sees, the ability to make the impossible look playful. But football careers aren't determined by talent alone. Injuries, expectations, pressure, timing. Sometimes the story people expect never becomes a story that happens. And perhaps that's why Neymar remains one of football's most compelling figures. Not because of what he achieved, but because of what might have been. Together, these players defined an era, not just through trophies, but through moments, because football is ultimately a game of memories. Nobody remembers every statistic. Nobody remembers every league table. People remember moments, Messi weaving through defenders, Ronaldo soaring above impossible heights, Neymar dancing past opponents, Modrić controlling an entire match with a single pass. Lewandowski scoring goals that seemed mathematically inevitable. These moments became landmarks in people's lives. Fans remember where they were when they watched them, who they watched them with, how old they were. Football became attached to memory, and memory became attached to football. That's why saying goodbye feels so difficult. Because we're not only saying goodbye to players, we're saying goodbye to versions of ourselves. The teenager who stayed awake to watch Champions League matches. The kid who copied Ronaldo's celebration in the backyard. The fan who argued endlessly about Messi versus Ronaldo. The generation that grew up alongside these players is growing older too. And that's the real story. Most people think football is about winning, but football has always been about time. Every great team eventually breaks apart. Every dynasty eventually ends. Every legend eventually retires. No matter how permanent they seem, The strange thing is that fans know this intellectually, but emotionally, they never believe it because heroes always feel immortal while they're still playing. The ending only becomes obvious once it's already over. And that's what makes the 2026 World Cup so unique. For younger players like Mbappe, Haaland, and Bellingham, it may represent a beginning. For Messi, Ronaldo, Neymar, Modrić, Lewandowski, it likely represents something else. A final chapter, a final appearance on football's biggest stage, one last opportunity to wear the shirt, one last national anthem, one last World Cup, and eventually, perhaps sooner than most fans expect, these players will become stories, then highlights, then statistics, then history. The next generation will know their achievements, but they won't know what it felt like. They won't know what it was like to witness it in real time, to spend nearly 20 years watching the same names dominate the sport, to live through the era instead of reading about it. And maybe that's the hidden lesson behind all of this. Every generation believes its heroes will last forever. They never do. One day, the players who defined your childhood become memories. Then those memories become history. Not because something went wrong, but because that's how every era ends. Football existed before Messi, before Ronaldo, before Neymar, before Modrić, before Lewandowski, and it will exist after them too. The game moves forward, it always does. But for one final tournament, the generation that shaped modern football may share the same stage one last time. And years from now, people will look back at the 2026 World Cup and remember the winners. They'll remember the goals, the drama, the trophies, but some fans will remember something else. They'll remember that it was a goodbye, and they were lucky enough to watch it happen.